Okay. That'll set the tone, right? Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here together. I'm Beth SCIBIENSKI, and I'm the almost pastor here at Clover Hill, and I'm just delighted to be with you this morning. When I think about funeral services and the idea that Christians have of resurrection, which seems just really hard in the 21st century, what does this mean to us and how do we celebrate it? I think about the use of the word resurrect that we use when we resurrect an idea or a thought, something that was over here, but we thought, oh, let's think about it again. And so when you think about George and the relationship that you've had with him, my thought for us today is, would you or could you find one snapshot or one moment or one memory and resurrect that memory to the front of your mind? And that if you look around, this gathered community is unique just for George, right? And so each of you have these memories of him, with him. And as you resurrect that idea, he is actually truly with us, resurrected among us. And that happens anytime you share memories with one another, as a family, over meals, in a month, in 2 years, later today, right? That resurrection can mean something after life that we don't understand yet, right? And it also can mean something very tangible today, right here and right now. And so I encourage you, as a way of welcome, to think about George and how you would want to resurrect him today. How would you want him to be right here with us? The things that you want to never forget or be forgotten. And so I call us to worship in that sense, knowing that God is faithful yesterday, today, tomorrow, that God was faithful to George, is faithful to you, and that God is faithful right here with us as we resurrect George in our midst. I've chosen a hymn that perhaps might not be a typical funeral hymn, and that's just a way of like warning because it's coming up. It's what I thought of as I was thinking about George and his life's work. And so would you join me in this opening prayer? Eternal God, we bless you for the great company of all those who have kept the faith, who have finished their race, and who now rest from their labor. We praise you for those dear to us, whom we name in our hearts before you. For George Conard'S, whom you have now received into your presence. Help us to believe where we have not seen, trusting you to lead us through our years. Be with us today in this gathered community. Draw us into your presence that we might experience communion with you and with one another. Amen. As you're able, please stand and let's sing the first 2 verses of All Things Bright and Beautiful. Please be seated. I wanted us to have a semi-informal time of sharing memories. Let's see if I can do this without hurting myself. Some of you are panicking. You don't have to share anything if you don't want, right? There are other people who are totally comfortable sharing. And so I just wanted, as a way to get to know George myself even, or to hear from you, what do you want to make sure we remember about him? Do you have a memory or even a word, something that would describe him? Who is George? Let's resurrect him together. Kindness. I've heard that already. Yeah. Say again. Humble. Loving. Funny? Yeah? Loyal. Supportive. He was a good listener. Sorry. Community. Oh, community was so important to him. Absolutely. A farmer. Pilot, too, right? He was very thoughtful. He's a faithful church member. Right. So the story is that she was on the finance committee with him when there was a debt and some concern here at church. And he was thoughtful. He would listen. There's probably anxiety in the room. He's listening. And then after time, which is a wise person, right, to wait to the end, when he had something to say, he had the wise thing to say. Any other memories? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. What a tremendous gift to the community. So the story is that George helped you, like so many families, have credit for your farm to continue to do what you want to do and what we need you to do, right? I'm appreciative that there's even emotion in that, because that means it was heartfelt and not just someone who's working at a desk, right? That he really cared about the people, his clients, the people that were right in front of him. Oh, you had something to share. Yeah. So he was very quiet, but you knew that his presence was there, right? He was very present. Someone was about to say something. Okay. He was a know-it-all without being a know-it-all. Just for those who are listening away. Uh-huh. Wow. You were roomies?
repeat. The neighbor's rabbit. Yeah. It was my office. Oh no. Oh no. Long time. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. 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 So, yeah. So I'm repeating also because we're recording and people might be streaming, and so I love that they were building a house. Some of you heard it, but I'll repeat it. They were building a house, delayed as builders happen, and Judy and George opened their home. Said, just we're going away for a couple months. You just stay, or a couple weeks. You stay in our home. Wasn't done in a couple weeks. Stayed for another month, right? So that's really what we call hospitality, right? Which is actually a really rich Jewish and Christian tradition, right? Is to open your home or your life and welcome another in, right? And choose community like that even when it's sacrificial. And so what a beautiful, beautiful example. That's okay. We can have emotions when we're having hospitality, right? So she said that I accused George of screaming into his pillow every night, and he never denied that. So, anything else we want to make sure we remember about him? Well, I'm going to invite Steve forward, and then you can share. Whichever what's your preference? Come on up.
I was just saying to Beth, I've actually never been behind this altar. I've been on the other side many, many times. Hi, can you hear me? One second.
Is it this one that he's talking to, or this one?
I'll just talk really loud.
Here. Oh
No,
my
no,
gosh,
it's all
this
right.
thing is going to kill me before the end of the day. Here, we know that this one's working. It's attached.
It's all right. I will just speak very loudly. I was saying to Beth that this is the first time I've ever been behind the altar at this church. I've been where you are many times. Actually, it looks pretty nice up here. So it's nice that you guys are telling stories about George. I wrote down some of my own, also trying to keep it a little bit light. You know, everyone was saying such nice things about George. I dare any of you to say anything bad about George. I couldn't think of anything in his life that was negative. You know, I'm Steve King, by the way, so I am George's wife Judy's youngest son. So George was my stepdad. I also, like Earl was saying, have known George for more than 40 years. I came to New Jersey in 1981 when I was 17 years old. And thinking about that last night, you couldn't have blamed George for not being super happy about having this kid show up in his life. But that was not at all the case. George was actually very happy to see me and very accepting, and just moved over and made room for me in his life with my mother. It was really quite incredible. Now, that was kind of George's way. You know, he was an extremely patient man. And some of that, I think, is being a farmer. You know, you plant the seeds and the crop will grow. With me, I was 17. George employed what I would kind of call a stealth parenting technique, right? That really worked well with me. The thing you got to know about George is he rarely did anything without a purpose. He would just never tell you what it was. And he really believed in letting you make your own mistakes. Lord knows I made plenty. So I'll give you a couple of stories. When I first came to New Jersey, I threw hay up on the Lane farm, which is really right down the street here. George had just recently given that farm operation over to Tom and Jim Lane. It actually wasn't too long after his friend and farming partner, Everett Hill, had passed away. So that first morning, I walked out of the bedroom wearing shorts and sneakers, ready to be a farmer. George didn't say anything. He dropped me off on the way to Farm Credit. The next day, I wore jeans and work boots. Now, I would have in that case said, you know, hey, you idiot, go put on some pants. But George didn't. As a matter of fact, George wouldn't have said idiot. I don't think the most derogatory term in George's entire vocabulary was clown. And you had to be pretty seriously incompetent to get clown. I might have had the record, but tell you a story, another story. George helped me buy my first car. It was a small pickup truck. And I didn't know this until many, many years later, but he purposely picked the worst truck at the worst car dealer with the worst salesman for our first stop. So we walked in there, we sat down, we were talking to the sales guy. George got up and left. And I proceeded to make the worst car deal ever known to man. George came back in, sat down, listened to it, just looked the guy right in the eyes and just politely declined the deal. We got up and we left. I was like, George, I think I signed something. I think we have an agreement. He just said, no, don't worry about it. So he would try to teach you. You weren't really sure you were getting taught. I have to admit, I kind of do some stealth parenting techniques myself. My girls are actually here, so I'm not going to give you any of those details. Many years later, we had, George has always had a pickup truck. The last one we had it was old and the brakes weren't too good. And my mother had made the proclamation that her granddaughters were neither going to drive nor ride in that truck. So George and I again went out and went in and have bought a truck together. That transaction actually went much smoother than that first one so long ago. And we really enjoyed riding around together. George and I would go down to recycling quite often. George was so well known at Raritan Township's recycling, they just called him Pops. And if you brought anything other than cardboard or recycling, you had to have a little ticket, a little green ticket, except if you were George. They would just drive in there and they go, oh, it's Pops. Go ahead, do whatever you want. Actually, the last time we went there, that wasn't true. I drove in and there must have been a new kid. He asked for the ticket. I kind of actually moved back in the car and said, listen, to kind of show him who I was with, but I gave him the ticket. So Earl mentioned this, but it was really true that George had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of this area. And in recent years, actually just recently, George and I had taken to driving the pickup truck around, and he'd tell me stories about where we were driving and what we were looking at. He was kind of like books on tape for the Somerville, Morris, Hunterdon counties. But he told me a lot of really good stories. A lot of them were about, the farms and the farmers. He told me a story. This is a long time ago when Farm Credit was still on Main Street in Flemington. He had made a loan to a farmer and the numbers didn't really add up. And I think it got flagged at a higher level that they were, that he was taking too much of a risk. But what George told me was, you'd measure the land and the equipment and the buildings but George was going to measure the farmer, and he'd bet on them. And just like George, he didn't tell you the end of the story, like how did it work out? That wasn't any, so I had to like press on that, and he still wouldn't say he made the right choice. He wasn't going to give himself credit. He gave the farmer credit. And he said, that farmer did very well and ended up owning really most of that side of that valley over the many years that he then farmed. And that was a lot about George. He'd measure people before he'd measure things. We would go down to the Belmead Farmers Co-op quite a bit, picking things up. That was kind of George's neighborhood as he was growing up as a boy. He'd tell me stories. His grandfather's farm had been taken by the government as a depot in the Second World War. George had a farm when he was a grade school child. His school was right against those railroad tracks at that depot. So in the Second World War, he'd be in whatever he was, the first or second grade, and tanks and artillery and planes would be floating by on flat cars. And even George couldn't resist that. He paid no attention whatsoever until the train finished going by. I'd ask him, sometimes if it was good land or bad land we were going through, or a good farm or a bad farm. George would never even say the land was bad. He'd just say it was okay. If the land was okay, you knew it was bad. So as we went around. So that's really all I had written down here. I could tell stories about George all day. I'll just finish with this. George was a happy guy. He lived a long and a great life, and he was content. He was a very content man. You all know, if you knew him, there was never a more honest or decent guy. He did tell me once, when he was young with his brothers and sisters, his father would occasionally, but not very often, get ice cream at a local dairy that had an ice cream plant. And there you'd actually either bring your own containers at the time, or they'd give you these brown cardboard ones. You didn't get a choice of flavor. It's whatever they had made that day. But that was a real treat for George when he was young and with his brothers and sisters. Well, I've seen George have a small bowl of ice cream after dinner for the last 40 years. And I got to tell you, even though it was no longer scarce, he still considered that ice cream a treat every day. That's really something remarkable. Thank you, guys.
I chose the scripture from Ecclesiastes to perhaps draw our attention. So, allow me to read it. I'm actually going to read to probably verse 15. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and then a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I've seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. God has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, God has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it's God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken away from it. God has done this. so that all should stand in awe before God. That which is already has been, that which is to be already is, and God seeks out what has gone by. The word of the Lord. So I took liberties as I was imagining George's life. It's been delightful to hear your memories. But when a pastor comes in touch with someone who is a farmer, the first thing, at least my friends, my ilk of pastors do, is they think of the poet and essayist Wendell Berry. Do you know him at all? Okay. He is a poet, essayist. He's a farmer. He lives in Kentucky. And like I said, that's who pastors go to when they want to reflect on land and agriculture and faith and life. And so after speaking with Judy the other day and reading about George and listening to some memories now even, given so much of his life to the world as farming, not just the land cultivation. I love that distance that he didn't judge the land or measure the land, he measured the person. To be a co-founder of 4-H, I mean, this is really, really important in our world. A deep connection to place right here and a life that's in that place. It makes sense that I would return to Barry's writing as a way to celebrate George's life. And so here's one little poem I found that just made me smile as I was thinking. He writes, "In a dream, I met my dear friend. He has, I know, gone long and far, and yet he is the same, for the dead are changeless. They grow no longer. It is I who have changed, grown strange to what I was. Yet I, the changed one, ask, 'How you been?' And he grins and looks at me. I've been eating peaches off some mighty fine trees." I don't know if George liked peaches. Did he really? Because I would easily change it to, "I've been eating really great ice cream." It's kind of fun to imagine the afterlife as a walk through a grove of fruit trees. I mean, I suppose it's the delight in the little things, which we all just heard. That's what gets me, I think, with this poem. Oh, I really have to tell myself to with this thing. Wow. Sorry. The little things, that's what I said, right? If we were to ask someone who has gone from here to tell us what is happening there, I guess we would think they might have some profound understanding of the universe, right, to offer us. Tell us something I don't know, something that give us wisdom that we can't get here on earth, right? But this poem offers peaches off mighty fine trees. I mean, for goodness sake, we can do that here, can't we? We can eat peaches off mighty fine trees. I mean, tell me something I don't know. Gives you a little different perspective on heaven or paradise. I also think that's what the author of Ecclesiastes is trying to do. Here she is naming all the days of our life, right? Every memory, happy, sad, celebrations, grief. The poem in Ecclesiastes zooms out, whereas the poem from Barry zooms in. And so this one zooms out to show us a whole life, all the seasons of life. They're all in there, right? We don't miss out on anything. We get to experience so much, building and tearing down, laughing, weeping, sowing, reaping. Life is full. As I can see, that was true of George and his life. In perhaps his most famous poem, The Peace of Wild Things, right? Barry says, "When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought or grief. I come into the presence of still waters, and I feel above me the day-blind stars, waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace
of the world and am free. I wish I had met George. And so I don't want to presume too much of what he might want for you, but as I have reflected on his life, I can offer my wish for you, my prayer for you. That you would remember George, dad, pops, grandpa, husband, friend, by resting in the grace of the world, resting in the natural world, getting out of our heads and our worries and walking through a field or eating a peach. That you might put your hand and your heart into each day, into every season of your life. All of them are precious. Amen. The family asked that we sing in the garden, and so if you're able, please stand and we'll sing together. Please be seated. Let's turn our attention to prayer. Would you join me? Gracious God, creator of all, we are so grateful today for George's life, for the relationships we each have, what we remember. We're grateful that you made us such complex beings, that we have feelings sometimes that we understand and sometimes that we don't. We are grateful that you are with us. You have been with us and you will be with us. And we ask today, God, for a specific grace, that we might know your presence as we spend time together, as we remember George, as you draw our attention to different parts of our lives. We ask that you would give us comfort when we need it, that you would give us laughter when we need it, that you would offer us silence when we need it. We give you thanks for little things like peaches and for big things like measuring people and not land. Thank you for how you work in our lives as evidenced by how George lived his life. And we ask that you continue to work in our lives, to live in our lives, that we might be gentle and kind, generous, hospitable. For these and for all things, we give you thanks, and we offer them to you in the name of Jesus, who taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. If you are able, let's stand and sing the last two verses of All Things Bright and Beautiful.